nonchalantly, "That woman is Amelia Martinez." Ronald Blackwood was taken aback, immediately recalling the reports from their spies about an assassination attempt on Amelia Martinez. At first, he'd thought it was Charles Blackwood who had sent the attackers to test her companion's skills. But now, seeing Charles Blackwood himself injured, and not lightly, it left him momentarily dazed. Charles Blackwood noticed the confusion on Ronald Blackwood's face. He knew his brother's thoughts well, just as he was aware of Ronald Blackwood's feelings for Isabella Thorne. Fortunately, Ronald Blackwood kept his emotions in check and didn't overstep, which allowed Charles Blackwood to feel at ease around his brother. "It was my doing. Don't bother guessing," Charles Blackwood said calmly, as if the injuries he bore weren't his own and as though everything he had done today was merely an observer's judgment rather than his own actions. Though Ronald Blackwood had suspected as much, hearing Charles Blackwood confirm it still left him unsettled. He looked at Charles Blackwood's blood-stained shoulders and, slightly puzzled, asked, "Brother, was there really any need for this?" Charles Blackwood didn't respond to the question right away. Instead, he stood, changed into a fresh coat, and smoothed his hair before answering, "If I hadn't done it, they would have grown suspicious." "How skilled is that woman?" Ronald Blackwood understood his brother's reasoning. They had been inseparable over the years, closer than any other siblings, sharing almost everything, except for the matter of Isabella Thorne. Their deep understanding of each other was what had kept them at peace for so long. Knowing this, Ronald Blackwood let the topic go and asked a question that aligned with Charles Blackwood's line of thinking. In Ronald Blackwood's eyes, Charles Blackwood's image had shifted. He had always seen him as compassionate and just, as the Emperor described him. It was one reason why the Emperor had chosen Charles Blackwood over Henry Blackwood as Crown Prince. But in a turbulent world, kindness and virtue often lead to ruin. Ruthlessness was sometimes essential. At times, Ronald Blackwood had to remind his brother to prioritize the larger goals, never letting romantic entanglements shake his resolve. Yet the recent events and today's incident were beyond Ronald Blackwood's understanding. Charles Blackwood had undertaken these ruthless actions without consulting him. His brother seemed to be growing more calculating, his methods sharp and merciless, even instilling a bit of fear in Ronald Blackwood. On the one hand, this was what he had hoped for. But now that his brother had become so deeply strategic and shrewd, he was unsure whether to feel pleased or apprehensive. Noticing Ronald Blackwood lost in thought, Charles Blackwood gave a subtle smile. After he finished speaking, he realized his brother hadn't absorbed a word. With a sigh, Charles Blackwood gently nudged him and continued, "Brother Ronald, weren't you the one who taught me that sometimes, our methods must be ruthless? Even if it means injuring ourselves, as long as we survive, we can recover. Isn't that right?" Ronald Blackwood blinked in surprise. Had he really said that? Perhaps he had, though he couldn't quite recall. A faint, forced smile crossed his lips, lacking genuine happiness. Charles Blackwood understood Ronald Blackwood's thoughts. Lately, he had made these uncharacteristically harsh decisions without discussing them. Even he found himself somewhat surprised by his actions, possibly because of his deep commitment to the throne and his desire to secure happiness for Isabella Thorne. Ignoring Ronald Blackwood's reservations, Charles Blackwood continued, "It seems we were overthinking things. Amelia Martinez doesn't know martial arts. Initially, I saw her practicing a few forms, but they were merely decorative moves, nothing substantial. I thought she might be hiding something. Yet when those assassins appeared, she barely defended herself and didn't attempt to fight back. If I hadn't intervened, she would have been seriously injured, if not killed." Ronald Blackwood nodded thoughtfully, not doubting Charles Blackwood's words. The spies had also mentioned that Amelia Martinez was practicing some basic forms, likely just for health and self-defense, with no real combat skills. Then why bring her into the estate? Aren't you worried that Isabella Thorne will come looking for you? Ronald Blackwood was slightly displeased. Going to Serene Shadow Tower was one thing, but now bringing Amelia Martinez back home? If Isabella Thorne found out, she would be hurt. His biggest fear was that if the two women crossed paths, who knew what trouble might arise? Charles Blackwood had clearly thought about this. Hearing Ronald Blackwood bring it up, he replied without hesitation, "Tell Isabella Thorne to come to your place if she wants to see me in the coming days. It would be best if she didn't come here for now." "Do you truly believe Isabella Thorne won't be jealous?" Ronald Blackwood knew this was all part of a greater plan. Initially, Charles Blackwood had been hesitant, not wanting to make bold moves, but now that he had changed his strategy, Ronald Blackwood was the one feeling uneasy. He couldn't imagine any woman, no matter how understanding, accepting that the man she loved was bringing another woman into his home. "She'll understand," Charles Blackwood replied and left, leaving Ronald Blackwood standing there, trying to decipher his brother's thoughts but finding it futile. Amelia Martinez and her group were arranged in the East Wing, with their rooms close by. Charles Blackwood quickly crossed the hallway, reaching Amelia Martinez's room in no time. He knocked softly, and inside were Emily Johnson and Ava Wilson. Originally, Charles Blackwood had hoped to speak with Amelia Martinez privately, so seeing the others there made him feel momentarily awkward. Leaving now seemed rude, but staying was uncomfortable. Emily Johnson, sensing the discomfort, quickly called out, "Please come in, my lord." Realizing she had misspoken, she corrected herself, "I mean, your highness." Charles Blackwood gave an embarrassed smile and glanced at Amelia Martinez. Her eyes were calm, like a still lake, showing no ripples of emotion. She glanced at him briefly before looking away, as if she had forgotten the earlier intimacy and tender moments in the carriage, now appearing indifferent. "I came to return your handkerchief." Charles Blackwood pulled out the cloth embroidered with the black crane that Amelia Martinez had used to bind his wound earlier that day, trying to ease the tension. For the first time, Amelia Martinez's eyes showed a hint of light. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the handkerchief, gently caressing the black crane as if afraid it might fly away. Noticing her reaction, Charles Blackwood took the opportunity to ask, "That black crane didn't fade, even after soaking all afternoon. Do you know what kind of thread was used?" The question caused Amelia Martinez to freeze. She and Ava Wilson had reconciled earlier, and their misunderstanding had been smoothed over by her riddle. Seeing Amelia Martinez's expression change, Ava Wilson frowned and said, "I didn't realize that my lord was the crown prince. Forgive our lack of courtesy. But my sister is unwell and needs rest, so I must ask your highness to leave." Charles Blackwood didn't press further. Watching Amelia Martinez lost in thought, gently stroking the handkerchief, he quietly said goodbye and left. Afterward, Ava Wilson and Emily Johnson withdrew as well, leaving Amelia Martinez alone in the spacious room. Amelia Martinez kept rubbing the handkerchief in her hands, feeling the sorrow within this body. Her hands trembled involuntarily, and tears rolled down her cheeks. She hadn't thought of herself as truly sad, only sympathetic toward the woman she inhabited, yet somehow, she couldn't hold back her tears. In the darkness, a shadow lingered outside Amelia Martinez's door for a long time before quietly leaving. The Hall of Supreme Harmony. Princess Oliver Kingsley knelt before the court, her face full of worry. The Empress Dowager listened as Princess Oliver Kingsley recounted her tale. Seeing the princess sobbing, the Empress Dowager felt a pang of pity and quickly ordered her a seat. After thanking the Empress Dowager, Princess Oliver Kingsley sat beside her, still wiping away tears. Her eyes were swollen and red, resembling large almonds, and her tear-streaked face looked like a delicate flower in the rain. "So, you're saying someone attempted to assassinate that courtesan, Amelia Martinez?" The Empress Dowager sipped her tea, holding her hand gracefully as she questioned Princess Oliver Kingsley, who was beginning to calm down. But at the question, Princess Oliver Kingsley burst into tears again, her shoulders shaking, her makeup smudged. The Empress Dowager, troubled by her distress, knew Princess Oliver Kingsley was frightened. Yet, crying endlessly wouldn't solve anything. Raising her voice, she urged, "Just tell me." "Yes, your majesty." Princess Oliver Kingsley hurriedly wiped her tears, sniffing as she began her story from the beginning. "Yesterday afternoon, I heard there was an attempt on the life of a woman named Amelia at Serene Shadow Tower." She paused, worried the Empress Dowager might not understand, then clarified, "Amelia is actually the courtesan Amelia Martinez, a name bestowed by the prince." Several assassins in black appeared, but fortunately, her companions were skilled. Anne, at this point, Princess Oliver Kingsley's face turned green and then red, her gaze filled with a resentful anger fueled by jealousy. She couldn't comprehend why the two most outstanding men in the world had abandoned her, only to fall for a courtesan. In that moment, Princess Oliver Kingsley completely forgot her original purpose for being there. "Go on," the Empress Dowager said, her eyes closed as her long nails tapped rhythmically on the table. Sensing Princess Oliver Kingsley had paused, she seemed displeased. Princess Oliver Kingsley didn't dare disobey. Though she had already cursed Amelia Martinez 1,000 times in her heart, wishing she could tear her apart, she quickly resumed, "And the Crown Prince was also involved. They say he was seriously injured." The Empress Dowager's eyes shot open, staring at Princess Oliver Kingsley with disbelief, gauging whether she was telling the truth. After a long pause, she finally spoke, "You're saying Charles was there too, and he was injured?" Princess Oliver Kingsley nodded rapidly, not daring to hide anything. "So, who do you believe could be behind this?" Now understanding Princess Oliver Kingsley's true purpose, the Empress Dowager asked her opinion. Although Princess Oliver Kingsley was often spoiled and willful, she was also a timid person, clearly frightened of Henry Blackwood's potential reprisal. "I don't know, Your Majesty." Princess Oliver Kingsley quickly knelt again, all of her usual haughtiness replaced with fear. She couldn't forget the murderous look Henry Blackwood had given her, as if he were ready to kill her right then and there. He probably knew of everything that had happened, and at this very moment, could be searching for her. At this thought, Princess Oliver Kingsley frantically pleaded, "Empress Dowager, Aunt, please help me. The prince surely believes I did this, and if I return, he won't spare me. He wouldn't dare to defy me." The Empress Dowager, seeing how terrified Princess Oliver Kingsley was, assumed Henry Blackwood must have treated her poorly in the past, making her fury rise. She slammed her hands on the table and shouted. Princess Oliver Kingsley knelt below, unable to understand why the Empress Dowager had suddenly become angry. She remained silent, not daring to utter another word. "This really wasn't your doing?" The Empress Dowager, still seemingly uncertain, asked again. Princess Oliver Kingsley, raised in luxury, had been spoiled from a young age. If she had done something thoughtless out of anger, it wouldn't have been unthinkable. However, seeing her current demeanor, the Empress Dowager began to realize that this incident might not have much to do with Oliver Kingsley. But Princess Oliver Kingsley had no idea of the Empress Dowager's thoughts. She believed that even the Empress Dowager didn't trust her and began to cry, kowtowing repeatedly. "Aunt, you know Oliver Kingsley best. Even if I can be reckless, I wouldn't do something that harms others while gaining nothing." The Empress Dowager nodded heavily, unable to deduce who might have orchestrated such a scheme. Could there be a third faction beyond her own and the Crown Prince's? Why would they conceal themselves so well, making it impossible to detect them? She knew she would need to be more cautious. Charles Blackwood had been seriously injured. The child was kind-hearted and would never resort to trickery that could ensnare himself. This also couldn't be the work of Henry Blackwood, otherwise, Princess Oliver Kingsley wouldn't be so fearful. The Empress Dowager, unsure of how to proceed, felt her worry grow. It was already challenging enough to contend with two opposing factions, and now a mysterious third force had appeared. Investigating further would be essential. Princess Oliver Kingsley watched the Empress Dowager's tense face, afraid to disturb her, and continued kneeling quietly. When her legs began to feel numb and she hesitated to stand, the Empress Dowager suddenly spoke, "You may go back in peace. If the prince dares to harm you, come to me. I don't believe he would dare to act against us, even with our family's military power. Princess Oliver Kingsley heard every word clearly, feeling her trip had not been in vain. With the Empress Dowager's support, she began to regain her confidence, even contemplating her relationship with Henry Blackwood. After all, he was still her husband, and even though he treated her coldly, she didn't want him in danger. Empress Dowager, how do you intend to deal with the prince? Princess Oliver Kingsley couldn't help but ask, hoping for some reassurance about whether she should manage things herself or leave them to the Empress Dowager. To Princess Oliver Kingsley's surprise, the Empress Dowager did not scold her but rather sighed, stepping down herself to help Oliver Kingsley up, and spoke kindly, Oliver Kingsley, you've endured much. It's rare to see you still consider his well-being. Don't worry, I won't be too harsh for your sake. I only mean to remind him that our family is not easily trifled with. Hearing the Empress Dowager's words, Princess Oliver Kingsley felt both comforted and slightly moved. The Empress Dowager held her hand like a family member, making her feel elated. In challenging times, her family still stood by her side. After expressing her gratitude, Princess Oliver Kingsley confidently returned to the prince's residence. Admit it, was it you? Princess Oliver Kingsley, weary from her journey back to the residence, had barely stepped through the gates when Henry Blackwood blocked her way. The sight of him made her legs tremble uncontrollably. Before she could say a word, Henry Blackwood gripped her throat, leaving her no chance to escape. Just as she had feared, Henry Blackwood acted exactly as she had dreaded. His burning gaze seemed intent on setting her ablaze. Princess Oliver Kingsley struggled to shake her head, trying to speak, but his grip made it impossible for her to utter a sound. She struggled, her face pale as tears rolled down her cheeks, falling onto Henry Blackwood's hand. In that moment, it seemed as though he regained a bit of his sanity and finally loosened his grip. Henry Blackwood released Princess Oliver Kingsley forcefully, pushing her half a meter away. She lay on the ground, coughing, her cheeks flushed from choking, and his gaze showed not a trace of sympathy. In his eyes, no one could compare to Amelia. Even if she was in someone else's residence, laughing and talking with others, only he had the right to protect her, and no one else was allowed to hurt her. Speak. That one curt, commanding word from Henry Blackwood made Princess Oliver Kingsley tremble all over. She had never seen him lose control like this, especially over a courtesan, treating her with cold disregard time and time again. Even her father had never scolded her, yet Henry Blackwood could be this heartless. Why? Why? What's so special about that shameless woman? She lost her virtue long ago, played with by countless men, and now she's with the crown. Princess Oliver Kingsley saw his icy attitude and her anger flared. She couldn't contain the resentment and curses she had kept bottled up for so long. But before she could finish, his slap came down hard, leaving her stunned and unconscious. Henry Blackwood's face darkened, veins popping on his forehead, his sharp, dark eyes burning into Princess Oliver Kingsley as if he wanted to set her ablaze. He gripped her chin with fierce strength, showing no mercy, his fingers pressing down with such force that, if he could, he would crush this woman entirely. His voice was cold, like a demon's growl. Let me tell you, no one is allowed to insult the woman I love. No matter what she's been through, in my eyes, she is worth 1,000 times more than you. With that, Henry Blackwood shoved Princess Oliver Kingsley hard, jolting her awake from her daze. She stared at him in shock, as if she no longer recognized the man in front of her. Although she had known he wouldn't easily forgive her, she hadn't expected that just a few words could provoke him to slap her so ruthlessly. Last time, Amelia Martinez had slapped her, and Henry Blackwood had done nothing to defend her. Now, he had slapped her himself. Why? Why did everyone treat her so cruelly? His words echoed like thunder in her ears. No matter what she's been through, in my eyes, she's worth 1,000 times more than you. Princess Oliver Kingsley laughed bitterly, realizing that in his heart, that courtesan held a place so important that she could never hope to reach it. She couldn't understand why the two most exceptional men both left her because of this woman. She felt hatred. It wasn't me. The Empress Dowager said she wants you to see her, Princess Oliver Kingsley managed to say, mustering the last of her courage. She no longer cared about Henry Blackwood's expression, whether it was rage or disdain. She didn't care anymore. She wanted to wash her hands of everything and let them handle it. Unexpectedly, upon hearing this, Henry Blackwood tensed up again, his gaze turning violent as he glared at the crumpled figure on the ground. He grabbed her collar, growling, "So, you ran to get reinforcements?" Princess Oliver Kingsley shook her head frantically, terrified he would take further extreme action. Desperate to explain, she pleaded for mercy. The slap from earlier was forgotten, she only wanted him to spare her. No, it wasn't like that. I was afraid you would suspect me, so I went to the Empress Dowager for help. Henry Blackwood paused at her words, then spoke in a softer but still cold voice, "If you didn't do it, then why do you look so guilty?" Princess Oliver Kingsley wanted to explain further, but Henry Blackwood no longer had the patience to listen. He knew exactly why the Empress Dowager was summoning him to the palace. Reflecting on his behavior, he realized he may have overstepped. No matter how wrong Princess Oliver Kingsley was, she was still a princess. Treating her this way was almost like directly disrespecting the Empress Dowager. "You needn't worry anymore. I promised you the position of Empress, and it will be yours." Henry Blackwood, standing at the door, tossed out this final assurance with a hint of reluctant compassion. He knew that to ultimately defeat Charles Blackwood, he needed the support of the Prime Minister's family and a strong alliance with the Empress Dowager. Passing by the Crown Prince's residence, Henry Blackwood couldn't help but crane his neck, hoping for a glimpse of Amelia Martinez. But the gates were shut, locking away not only her but his heart as well. Although he wasn't sure who had caused the recent turmoil, he knew that, for now, Amelia was safe in the Crown Prince's residence. Even if his rivals planned to use her to threaten him, they wouldn't succeed easily. He trusted that his beloved would stay strong. "I heard the Empress Dowager summoned Henry Blackwood to the palace." Ronald Blackwood suddenly appeared behind Charles Blackwood, speaking thoughtfully. Charles Blackwood nodded slightly, he had known since early morning. He could imagine Henry Blackwood's reaction upon learning of Amelia Martinez's situation, perhaps even wanting to choke her in anger. "Don't worry, it's likely a family matter," Charles Blackwood assured, noticing Ronald Blackwood's concerned look. Ronald Blackwood nodded, having heard some details about the morning incident. It seemed that Henry Blackwood's temperament hadn't changed, he remained as volatile as ever. "One knock was here looking for you earlier. I asked her to wait at my place," Ronald Blackwood mentioned suddenly. "Tell her I'm busy and don't have time to meet," Charles Blackwood replied after a brief pause, finally settling on a way to decline. Ronald Blackwood seemed hesitant, trying one last time to persuade him. "Are you sure you won't go?" Before Charles Blackwood could respond, Ronald Blackwood noticed Amelia Martinez nearby. Charles Blackwood saw her too, quickly shifting his expression, and with a casual, graceful wave of his fan, approached her. Ronald Blackwood followed suit. Amelia Martinez had already seen the two of them coming. With their approach, she felt uncertain whether to stay or leave. As she hesitated, Charles Blackwood reached her. "Why aren't you resting?" Charles Blackwood chided gently, noticing her slightly furrowed brows. Her abdominal injury hadn't healed fully, and she had only stepped out for a breath of fresh air, not expecting to run into them. Seeing Charles Blackwood's genuine concern and Ronald Blackwood's unreadable gaze, she lowered her head slightly, as if to avoid them. Ronald Blackwood seemed to have more to say to Charles Blackwood, but seeing his attentiveness, he hesitated, uncertain whether to stay or leave, and kept watching Amelia Martinez. When Amelia Martinez lifted her head, her eyes met Ronald Blackwood's gaze. Feeling awkward, she offered a polite smile and said, "I've heard that young Master Ronald has excellent skills in chess. I've been hoping to find an opportunity to play a game." Ronald Blackwood, caught off guard, didn't know if he should decline or accept her invitation. But Charles Blackwood, ever perceptive, quickly stepped in to diffuse the situation, responding with the ease and familiarity of a longtime friend. With a seamless grace, he said, "You're not fully recovered. If you want to play chess, let's save it for another day." Amelia Martinez had only mentioned chess in passing, and seeing Charles Blackwood respond so smoothly, she quickly nodded, dropping the matter with a grateful smile. Charles Blackwood initially intended to escort Amelia Martinez back to her room, but Amelia Martinez was mindful of her surroundings. Since she was staying in someone else's residence, she knew it wasn't appropriate to cause any unnecessary trouble. After Amelia Martinez left, Ronald Blackwood remarked, "This woman seems quite different from the rumors. She seems much easier to get along with." Charles Blackwood nodded in agreement but replied with some skepticism, "I had a similar thought that day," but she did give an explanation. "Life is short, being happy for a day is still a day, and being cold for a day is also a day. Given that, why not be happy every day? Makes sense, doesn't it?" Ronald Blackwood didn't quite agree and instead advised Charles Blackwood to be a bit more cautious, noting that people shouldn't be judged by appearances. "Brother, be mindful of her two attendants," Ronald Blackwood reminded before leaving. Charles Blackwood nodded seriously, as he had already been observing them closely. Hearing Ronald Blackwood's reminder, he replied, "I understand. I've already assigned someone to monitor them, any movements will be detected immediately." Ronald Blackwood nodded in satisfaction and then left. These days, Amelia Martinez found herself in a state of boredom. At first, she thought Charles Blackwood might visit her now and then, but half a month had passed, and there was still no sign of him. Strangely, Amelia Martinez felt a bit of longing. Her wound had almost healed, and she could move around a bit as long as she avoided strenuous activity. As for Emily Johnson, her injuries were more severe, making it hard for her to move around for the time being. Amelia Martinez gazed outside through the carved window, feeling a wave of restlessness. She thought to herself that staying here indefinitely wasn't an option. After all, she and Charles Blackwood weren't that close, and staying here too long could easily invite gossip. Serene Shadowlout didn't seem entirely safe either, so it would be best to wait until Emily Johnson had recovered before making a decision. Moreover, Amelia Martinez was even more worried about Henry Blackwood. She wondered if he knew she was staying with Charles Blackwood and whether he would come looking for her. Amelia Martinez sank deep into thought. That day, she had agreed to follow Charles Blackwood to the Crown Prince's residence mainly to annoy Henry Blackwood, or perhaps to give him a bit of pressure, to show him that she had her own thoughts and wouldn't just wait around for him. But now, Henry Blackwood seemed completely unresponsive, and she had no idea what he was thinking. Amelia Martinez also noticed a change in Ava Wilson and James Smith. In recent days, they had stayed close to her, engaging her in conversations. But to Amelia Martinez, it felt more like surveillance. Remembering Ava Wilson's attitude toward Charles Blackwood earlier, they had likely figured out Charles Blackwood's identity and were fully aware of the rivalry between Henry Blackwood and Charles Blackwood. What Ava Wilson and James Smith probably didn't realize, however, was that Amelia Martinez had long known about Charles Blackwood's identity as well. She, like them, was just pretending not to know. Thus, it was as if they were playing a game of hide and seek. Amelia Martinez couldn't help but shake her head, realizing that even among those who appeared close, such significant secrets could exist. It seemed that in any world, the only person she could truly rely on was herself. "What are you thinking about?" Charles Blackwood had been standing a short distance away, watching Amelia Martinez staring blankly in his direction. At first, he thought she was looking at him, but after moving around a bit, he realized she was simply lost in thought. "Thinking about you." Charles Blackwood suddenly stepped inside, startling Amelia Martinez. Seeing Charles Blackwood's question, she blurted out a casual response. Charles Blackwood was initially taken aback by Amelia Martinez's sudden change in demeanor. Her words had become direct and bold, though he didn't mind it. It was only when he noticed Amelia Martinez's sly smile that he realized he'd been teased again, and he could only smile helplessly in return. The two quickly returned to a calm atmosphere. Amelia Martinez was somewhat perplexed as to why Charles Blackwood hadn't come to see her for the past few days, and now that he was here, she couldn't guess what he meant by it. Perhaps he only visited her whenever he happened to think of her, and when she wasn't on his mind, he simply set her aside. Charles Blackwood, on the other hand, was trying to understand Amelia Martinez's intentions. Observing her in recent days, he'd noticed she seemed quieter, often sitting alone by the window as if lost in thought, leading him to wonder if she was beginning to miss him. But seeing her now, she didn't seem particularly pleased to see him. Could it be that he'd gone too far in deliberately keeping his distance and had dampened her interest? "Why aren't you surprised by my identity?" Charles Blackwood suddenly changed the subject and asked. Amelia Martinez was unfazed. Instead, her gaze sparkled, and she smiled softly, saying, "Isn't it the same as you already knowing that I'm Amelia Martinez?" Charles Blackwood was taken aback, followed by a hint of embarrassment. Amelia Martinez, however, appeared completely nonchalant, as if her words had been spoken without a second thought. Charles Blackwood could only laugh awkwardly and say nothing more. With that unspoken barrier shattered, their relationship no longer seemed as easygoing as before. Charles Blackwood glanced at Amelia Martinez with slight concern, unsure of what she was truly thinking. Or perhaps he'd already harbored suspicions, and she was merely going along with his game, just as he'd suspected. "You don't need to worry," Amelia Martinez remarked, as if comforting herself or offering him reassurance. "I've heard much about the Crown Prince's reputation for kindness and integrity. Although he may not be exactly as rumored, he's certainly not a bad person." Charles Blackwood nodded, though inwardly he felt unsettled. Amelia Martinez was indeed clever, perhaps too clever. Cleverness taken too far could easily become cunning. Charles Blackwood couldn't help but ponder. It seemed that dealing with Amelia Martinez would require a bit more persistence. "As for the matter between you and the prince, I have no desire to pry. I only hope that our friendship remains free from any ulterior motives," Amelia Martinez continued, voicing her deepest concern. Charles Blackwood and Henry Blackwood had long been at odds, and she found herself caught between the two men. If she wasn't careful, she could be exploited to influence either side, something she had no wish to experience. She had seen far too many dramas with similar plots and could guess the twists all too easily. She only hoped her fears were unfounded. "A man's pursuit of power has little to do with women," Charles Blackwood responded after hearing Amelia Martinez's heartfelt words. Yet, even as he spoke, he felt a wave of shame. His own ambitions might not involve this woman, yet he still intended to use her. A slight sense of pity stirred in him. "The promise I made that day still stands. If you're willing," Charles Blackwood started to say. Before he could finish, Amelia Martinez raised her hand, stopping him. In recent days, she'd thought carefully about what Charles Blackwood had said that day. Despite his words sounding sincere and his injury sustained in her defense, she didn't want her emotions to cloud her reason. In this world, she knew that the only person she could truly trust was herself. Charles Blackwood smiled and shook his head, choosing not to say anything further. He didn't quite understand Amelia Martinez's attitude. If she'd agreed to come to his residence, why was she still so reserved? Could she be playing hard to get, or perhaps she was still harboring feelings for Henry Blackwood? No matter how Henry Blackwood had treated her, it seemed she still couldn't let go. Charles Blackwood couldn't help but chuckle bitterly. What did Henry Blackwood possess that was so appealing? He couldn't believe any woman could elude his grasp. So he said, "Your wound hasn't fully healed yet. You should stay in bed for a few more days. After that, I'll take you out for a walk." Amelia Martinez smiled and nodded. Although this residence was quite large, and she had wandered around various parts of it over the past few days, she didn't dare go too far. Even though Charles Blackwood had certainly instructed the servants, she still felt a bit uneasy, sensing something strange. Hearing now that she could go out for a walk made her quite happy, and she readily agreed. "How's everything, brother?" Ronald Blackwood asked. "I'm not sure. Over the next few days, have Isabella Thorne come directly to my residence to find me," Charles Blackwood said, his tone unusually serious. Ronald Blackwood looked slightly puzzled. In the past, whenever he had sent Isabella Thorne to the prince's residence to find Charles Blackwood, he would refuse. But now, after finally settling Isabella Thorne, Charles Blackwood wanted her to come visit him again. What was he really planning? Charles Blackwood clearly understood Ronald Blackwood's intention and, not wanting to keep him guessing, replied with a hint, "Sometimes, women need a bit of excitement." "You're even involving Isabella Thorne," Ronald Blackwood replied, his tone noticeably sharper, showing that he was restraining his anger and barely holding back his frustration. Charles Blackwood turned and approached Ronald Blackwood, snapping open his fan with a flick, and stared at him coldly, saying, "Isn't this the path you all chose for me? I've said before that I'm not interested in the throne, but as things stand now, I have no choice but to keep moving forward." Ronald Blackwood remained silent, for that was indeed the truth. He remembered how, in front of the old general, Charles Blackwood had once said that he only wished to live peacefully with Isabella Thorne. Yet he had no choice but to shoulder the responsibility for the country's future. In Ronald Blackwood's eyes, Henry Blackwood might not make a good ruler, which left him feeling torn. "Father's condition has worsened somewhat. In a few days, let's go and see him," Charles Blackwood said, pausing mid-sentence. He believed that Ronald Blackwood would understand, and that Isabella Thorne could also comprehend his struggles. To ascend the throne, he would have to sacrifice a great deal, and the losses would be even greater. But he had no way back now, no other choice. "Sister, what's been going on with you these days? Why are you always so absent-minded?" Ava Wilson entered with a bowl of medicine and saw Amelia Martinez still sitting by the window, holding a dark silk handkerchief of unknown origin that seemed to keep her lost in thought. Seeing that it was Ava Wilson, Amelia Martinez felt a twinge of unease but still smiled and replied, "The Crown Prince was just here," spoke a few words, and sat for a while. As she set the medicine down, Ava Wilson listened to Amelia Martinez's words, realizing that it was because of Charles Blackwood that she was so preoccupied, and she couldn't help feeling irritated. In recent days, she had reported Amelia's situation to Henry Blackwood, but not only did he not ask her to bring Amelia back to Serene Shadow Lao, he even instructed her to leave Amelia at the Crown Prince's residence and not concern herself with their relationship. This left Ava Wilson feeling deeply frustrated. She knew Vong Jia loved Amelia enough to sacrifice his life for her, but she couldn't understand why he would allow her to fall into another man's arms so willingly. Amelia Martinez noticed Ava Wilson's silence and guessed that she was lost in her own thoughts. She didn't try to guess what Ava Wilson was thinking. After finishing the bowl of medicine, Ava Wilson finally left. Though they had reconciled recently, no matter how much they tried, there was still a barrier between them, making everything feel polite and formal, with little hope of returning to the carefree days at Serene Shadow Lao. Now that Amelia Martinez knew about the relationship between Ava Wilson and Henry Blackwood, she couldn't pretend not to see it, nor could she continue acting as if they were close friends. Although Ava Wilson had treated her well and was simply following orders, Amelia Martinez couldn't stand living under Henry Blackwood's surveillance. She was a person, not prey to be manipulated at will. Mentioning Charles Blackwood earlier had been deliberate. Deep down, she still hoped Henry Blackwood would care about her, or that perhaps things might change because of it. She didn't believe that Ava Wilson wouldn't report the situation here to Henry Blackwood. Amelia Martinez herself wasn't sure exactly what she was seeking. Amelia Martinez found herself conflicted. On one hand, she wanted to escape Henry Blackwood's watchful eye and free herself from his control, but on the other, she yearned for his warm embrace, hoping to spend her life by his side. Could it be that one side of her reflected her true self, while the other belonged to the heart of this body she now inhabited? Amelia Martinez felt torn, wanting to act according to her own will and make the journey worthwhile. But at the same time, she had a mission and didn't want to break the heart of this body or cause it to part from Henry Blackwood. Amelia Martinez wondered if she was beginning to suffer from a split personality, uncertain of what to do. In the past, she could confide in Ava Wilson, but now Emily Johnson was bedridden, and James Smith was constantly tending to her. No matter how clueless or oblivious she was, Amelia Martinez wouldn't dare to go and be a third wheel. Seeing that she was alone and bored, and Charles Blackwood was unlikely to visit any time soon, Amelia Martinez decided to take out her harmonica and play a tune to entertain herself. Whether due to her distracted mood or unfamiliarity with the song, the melody sounded fragmented, full of broken notes and disjointed phrases. But Amelia Martinez didn't mind. Instead, she felt it gave the tune an unusual charm, as if conveying the essence of farewell and fragmentation. With this in mind, Amelia Martinez played with even more enthusiasm. A song that should have been sorrowful took on a lively, upbeat rhythm. The notes carried far and wide, resonating through the entire Crown Prince's residence. The music stopped Charles Blackwood in his tracks, and even Ronald Blackwood, standing nearby, began to tap along with the beat. When the tune ended, he asked, who could play such an enchanting melody? Charles Blackwood simply smiled, not saying a word. Ronald Blackwood quickly caught on to the implication and, in disbelief, asked, could it really be Amelia Martinez? Why wouldn't it be? Charles Blackwood replied, unfazed by Ronald Blackwood's surprise. In fact, he seemed slightly annoyed by his ignorance. Amelia Martinez was, after all, a celebrated courtesan of North Exyan Kingdom. If she didn't possess a few remarkable talents, no one would believe her reputation. Ronald Blackwood finally understood and looked at Charles Blackwood with some worry. He couldn't help but feel uneasy. Just as Isabella Thorne entered the Crown Prince's residence, she was captivated by the melodious sound of the harmonica. She was familiar with this place and had heard many performances from singers and musicians, but none had played such an enchanting melody on this unique instrument. Curious, Isabella Thorne followed the sound, suspecting that Charles Blackwood and his brother were listening to music. This made her job of locating them easier, and she eagerly headed in the direction of Amelia Martinez. However, the closer Isabella Thorne got, the more she felt something was amiss. This was the eastern wing, close to Charles Blackwood's residence but secluded and rarely frequented. Weeds had even begun to sprout on the steps, and although the courtyard seemed to have been tidied recently, signs of its former neglect were still evident. At that moment, the music abruptly stopped. Isabella Thorne felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't seen a soul, and the swaying shadows of the bamboo added an eerie atmosphere to the place. Startled, Isabella Thorne quickened her pace, wanting to leave this area as quickly as possible. She had never been here before and had no idea who could be lurking around. Thoughts of spirits and fox demons flitted through her mind, filling her with a sense of dread. "Excuse me, miss." Amelia Martinez stepped out from the room. She had stopped playing upon noticing this young woman. From her attire, she didn't appear to be a servant, so Amelia Martinez assumed she might have wandered here by mistake and stepped out to ask. Isabella Thorne, lost in her fearful musings, was startled by the sudden appearance of a woman in red. Shocked, she cried out, stumbled back, and fell to the ground, covering her mouth as her large, almond-shaped eyes widened in horror. Amelia Martinez felt puzzled, glancing behind her to confirm there was nothing there before taking a few steps forward. Yet, as soon as Isabella Thorne saw her approach, she quickly retreated, exclaiming, "Don't come any closer, don't come any closer." Amelia Martinez stopped, not daring to move forward. She didn't recognize the young woman and wasn't sure who she was. Since she was staying as a guest in someone else's residence, Amelia Martinez didn't want to offend anyone. Seeing that the young woman clearly didn't want her to come closer, she obediently stayed where she was. "What's going on, sister?" Ava Wilson heard the scream and rushed over, along with James Smith, both holding weapons, thinking something serious had happened. Seeing this, Isabella Thorne became even more flustered, quickly standing up. At this point, she guessed that these people weren't ghosts, but she still found Amelia Martinez, a beautiful woman in a striking red dress who seemed as otherworldly as a fox spirit. It was probably her music that had drawn Isabella Thorne here. Despite her lingering fear, her tone remained sharp as she shouted, "Who are you all, daring to appear in the Crown Prince's residence?" This left Amelia Martinez puzzled. She wondered who this girl might be, and from her attire, she appeared to be from a wealthy family. Relying on her instincts, Amelia Martinez quickly deduced the girl's possible identity and asked, could this be the Crown Prince's future consort? Isabella Thorne was surprised that the woman knew her identity. Although Charles Blackwood had never explicitly stated that she would be the Crown Princess, the Empress had already approved her, and she considered herself the rightful consort. Seeing that Amelia Martinez was perceptive, Isabella Thorne assumed she might be one of Charles Blackwood's friends. Not wanting to lose face, she adjusted her attire and, in her usual dignified manner, replied, that's right, she's my dear cousin." Ha! Before Isabella Thorne could finish, Charles Blackwood suddenly appeared, cutting off her words. It seemed he had been drawn here by her earlier shout. Initially, Isabella Thorne looked a bit dissatisfied, feeling that Brother Charles should have revealed her identity to this woman, making her back off. Between women, there was a natural sense of rivalry, and though she didn't know who Amelia Martinez was, Isabella Thorne already saw her as a potential rival. Amelia Martinez heard Charles Blackwood's words, and although he had intervened in time to go along with Isabella Thorne's statement, and she didn't show any disagreement, Amelia Martinez sensed something more complicated beneath the surface. However, she simply played along, exclaiming, so this is the Crown Prince's cousin. Such a beautiful young lady, surely, she will find an excellent husband in the future. Although Isabella Thorne wasn't exactly pleased with the remark, she understood Amelia Martinez's implication. However, with Charles Blackwood present, she couldn't afford to behave improperly. She stayed by Charles Blackwood's side and asked politely, I heard music coming from this direction and was drawn to it. Is this sister new here? Both Amelia Martinez and Charles Blackwood were caught off guard. After a moment, Charles Blackwood laughed heartily and pulled Isabella Thorne over to Amelia Martinez, introducing her, this is Lady Amelia, whom I've often mentioned to you. You mustn't be impolite to her in the future. Isabella Thorne naturally knew who Amelia was, a courtesan. Still, she didn't show any dissatisfaction. Instead, she took Amelia Martinez's hand and, with a sweet smile, said, Really? Sister Amelia, you are indeed as beautiful as they say. My cousin praised you so highly, but I didn't believe it until now. Seeing you, I now realize there truly exists such a pure and elegant beauty in this world. Isabella Thorne's flattery left Amelia Martinez momentarily speechless, her direction lost in the compliments. Although Isabella Thorne pretended to be warm, Amelia Martinez could tell that her feelings weren't as sunny as they appeared. However, if Isabella Thorne wanted to put on an act, Amelia Martinez would match it, taking Isabella Thorne's hand and responding with feigned affection, Oh, not at all. It's you, sister, who is truly as lovely as a flower. The moment you arrived, I felt my own beauty fade beside yours. Everyone present thought that the two of them hit it off immediately and regretted not meeting sooner. However, the two people involved were perfectly aware of the truth. Amelia Martinez appeared to smile amiably on the outside, but deep inside, she was already disgusted by the other woman's ugly face. If it weren't for Charles Blackwood being present, she wasn't sure if this woman would have tried to kill her. Isabella Thorne seemed to hear exactly what Amelia Martinez was thinking. She smiled sweetly on the outside, as if meeting an old sister, and almost wished they could instantly bond. But inside, she was thinking the same thing. If Charles Blackwood hadn't been here, she wouldn't have been so disgusted to pretend to be close to her. What she once thought was a beautiful face now seemed as revolting as a cockroach. She almost wanted to grab a knife and make a few cuts. From the very beginning, Isabella Thorne had developed a sense of hostility toward Amelia Martinez, but now, knowing she was that girl Charles Blackwood had mentioned, she felt even more jealous. Although she was reluctant to admit it, Miss Amelia was indeed very beautiful. She wasn't sure if Charles Blackwood could truly keep his promise and remain unmoved by such beauty. Charles Blackwood, of course, could see the sparks in both women's eyes. Amelia Martinez was fine, just smiling calmly, but the small flames in Isabella Thorne's eyes couldn't be extinguished no matter what. Charles Blackwood feared that if things continued this way, Isabella Thorne might cause some trouble. He had planned to explain things to her later, but he hadn't expected them to run into each other the moment they entered the room. Luckily, they had heard a scream and rushed over in time, preventing Isabella Thorne from continuing what she was saying. Otherwise, it would have all been for nothing. "Isabella Thorne, let's let Miss Amelia rest for a while. You and Ronald Blackwood can go play for now," Charles Blackwood quickly told Isabella Thorne, sending her over to Ronald Blackwood. Though Isabella Thorne was somewhat unwilling, seeing that Charles Blackwood had personally spoken, she couldn't bring herself to do anything that would embarrass him. So she forced a smile and said to Charles Blackwood, "All right, I'll go over first, Buca." Usually, Isabella Thorne would call Charles Blackwood Fwong Ca, but now she deliberately added emphasis to call him Buca, probably out of some jealousy. Though Charles Blackwood knew Isabella Thorne had a bit of a temper, he believed that after Ronald Blackwood spoke to her, she would understand, and her anger would pass. Thus, Charles Blackwood pretended not to care, waving his hand as if to dismiss the situation. Then, he turned to Amelia Martinez, who stood at the side, smiling but not quite smiling. He awkwardly apologized, saying, "I'm really sorry. I guess Miss Amelia is too charming, and that's why my cousin was attracted here too." Amelia Martinez didn't make a fuss about it. She thought that if she were in Isabella Thorne's place, she would probably like the girl too, lively, cheerful, with a delicate and modest appearance, knowing how to gauge situations and understanding when to retreat. In contrast, she felt cold and dark inside, like a shadow that had never been touched by sunlight. Amelia Martinez smiled and replied that she didn't mind. She didn't want Charles Blackwood to think she cared too much, so she pretended to be completely unaware, saying, "All right, Your Highness, you should go with your cousin now." In the next part of the story, Charles Blackwood notices the indifference in Amelia Martinez's expression. He had seen the change in her face earlier, and he suspected that she had already guessed the ambiguous relationship between him and Isabella Thorne. He had stepped in to stop Isabella Thorne from speaking, intentionally preventing her from revealing anything, because women's intuition was always sharp. But now, Amelia Martinez seemed indifferent, as though she didn't care. Though a little puzzled, Charles Blackwood glanced at her and decided to let her rest, then excused himself. Once Charles Blackwood went to Isabella Thorne, she had already calmed down. She regretted her earlier rashness and feared that Charles Blackwood might scold her later. When Charles Blackwood finally walked over to her, Ronald Blackwood discreetly left the pavilion. So now, only Charles Blackwood and Isabella Thorne remained inside. Isabella Thorne hurriedly bowed to Charles Blackwood, intending to apologize. Charles Blackwood understood her feelings, knowing she was feeling guilty, so he quickly helped her up. Isabella Thorne, unable to control her emotions, started to cry, looking at him with an innocent face as she said, "I'm sorry, Brother Charles, I didn't know Amelia Martinez was staying there. If I had known, I certainly wouldn't have gone back." Charles Blackwood pursed his lips and nodded slightly. Things were handled better than he had expected. However, looking at the situation, it seemed that Ronald Blackwood had not yet told Isabella Thorne the purpose of his trip. At this moment, he couldn't bring himself to tell Isabella Thorne the harsh truth. He could only hold her tightly and tell her not to overthink things. "Stay here with me today, okay?" Charles Blackwood whispered softly in Isabella Thorne's ear. Isabella Thorne eagerly nodded. Ever since Charles Blackwood started his dealings with Amelia Martinez, he had rarely had time to spend with her. Now, he was the one asking her to stay with him. Isabella Thorne couldn't help but feel an immense sense of joy. Especially when she thought about how Amelia Martinez was at the Crown Prince's residence, perhaps right at that moment, she could encounter her. The more she thought about it, the deeper she lowered her head. She reassured herself, no matter how beautiful Amelia Martinez is, no matter how she could make flowers bow and the moon hide, it doesn't matter to Charles Blackwood. His heart only belongs to me. She felt sure of his feelings for her, that she had nothing to worry about, and that his heart belonged only to her. Isabella Thorne was so happy that she almost cried. Meanwhile, Charles Blackwood couldn't help but fall deeper into his thoughts. After Charles Blackwood left, Amelia Martinez seemed still in a daze, standing there blankly. "Do you really believe that the girl has nothing to do with the Crown Prince?" Ava Wilson, who had been watching everything closely, saw that Amelia Martinez seemed somewhat lost and spoke out her doubts. "So what if she has a connection? It doesn't concern us. Let's go." Amelia Martinez, upon hearing this, felt no sadness, and coldly replied to Ava Wilson. Ava Wilson stood still and watched Amelia Martinez leave, shaking her head. She couldn't understand the thoughts of this young lady. The prince loved her so much, yet she chose the Crown Prince. Now, seeing the Crown Prince with another woman, she was indifferent, as if it had nothing to do with her. Could it be that her heart wasn't human? How could she be so calm? Ava Wilson really hoped that the prince would call her back right now. That way, the prince wouldn't have to endure the pain of longing, and the young lady she considered a little sister would suffer less. She could feel that Amelia Martinez was not happy. Every time she was alone, Ava Wilson would see her silently shed tears, tightly clutching a silk handkerchief. She didn't understand why that handkerchief had such significance to make someone feel so lost. At this moment, Amelia Martinez had not returned to her room. She was afraid Ava Wilson would follow her in. She didn't want too much interaction with Ava Wilson. Every time she saw the concerned look on her face, she would easily be reminded of Henry Blackwood. The two had acted so convincingly. If it weren't for this time, she might never have realized she had been living under surveillance for so long. At this point, James Smith still hadn't arrived, and only Emily Johnson was lying in bed. When someone entered, Emily Johnson thought it was James Smith. Amelia Martinez saw this and teased, "You don't want to see me? Then I'll call James Smith in." Emily Johnson quickly sat up, trying to stop Amelia Martinez. Amelia Martinez had only been joking, but she didn't want Emily Johnson to suffer any more harm, so she quickly approached and comforted her. Emily Johnson understood the joke and felt both angry and embarrassed. Amelia Martinez stopped teasing and immediately asked, "Is the wound better?" Emily Johnson now had a calm expression. Although her back still hurt, she nodded. "Don't worry, Emily Johnson is fine. It'll heal soon." Amelia Martinez nodded in gratitude, her eyes filled with guilt. This wound was caused by Emily Johnson taking it for her. She felt deeply thankful but didn't know how to express it. In the end, she could only softly say, "Rest well." Emily Johnson nodded as well, her eyes welling up with tears, as if they were about to spill over. Amelia Martinez wanted to tell a joke or a riddle to make Emily Johnson laugh, but she was afraid that if she laughed, her wound would open up again, and then Amelia Martinez would be heartbroken. After thinking it through, she decided to let Emily Johnson rest and casually talk to her to pass the time. Amelia Martinez suddenly remembered at the last time, they were quite intrigued by something called a phone. After a moment's thought, she said, "Actually, even when two people aren't together, they can still talk to each other." Emily Johnson immediately perked up, curious. "Here, we can write letters, use carrier pigeons, and even have postal stations. So, what do you use?" "Where I come from, we can talk just like we're sitting face to face, like this. It's called a mobile phone." Amelia Martinez regretted deeply that she didn't bring her phone on the day she traveled here. Every time it came up, she found it so hard to describe. Many people who time traveled brought theirs, yet she was the one who forgot. Is there really something that magical? Emily Johnson seemed skeptical, thinking that Amelia Martinez was just making up stories to amuse herself, like the time she said people could fly in the sky like birds. But seeing Amelia Martinez's serious expression, she didn't dare voice her doubts directly. Amelia Martinez didn't catch on to Emily Johnson's underlying meaning and kept talking, letting her thoughts flow. Speaking of home, her eyes gradually welled up with tears. Noticing this, Emily Johnson quickly asked, "Miss, are you missing home?" Facing Emily Johnson, Amelia Martinez didn't want to hide anything, keeping secrets was too exhausting. She nodded honestly. Emily Johnson comforted her, saying that once she felt better, she would accompany her back home. But Amelia Martinez could only sigh, "If there's no fortunate twist of fate, I can't go back." Emily Johnson didn't fully understand, but she imagined a place with so many unheard-of wonders must be a vast country, with difficult roads to travel. However, to reassure Amelia Martinez, she said, "Don't worry. In a few days, I'll help you ask around. Surely someone knows about such a wonderful place." Amelia Martinez didn't want to dampen Emily Johnson's enthusiasm, so she simply nodded and urged her to rest and recover, promising to visit her in a few days. Returning to her room, Amelia Martinez pulled out a joke book. Thankfully, it was a pirated copy. The first half was for passing the time, but the second half contained the key to returning home. Quickly, she immersed herself in the book. Using a calligraphy brush to write was difficult, and she regretted not bringing a ballpoint pen. She could only draw slowly. She looked at the star maps in the book, half guessing and half drawing, but despite all her efforts, she still couldn't make sense of it. Just then, Charles Blackwood walked in. Amelia Martinez quickly scrambled to gather her things, but one piece of paper still fell to the ground. Seeing her tense expression, Charles Blackwood smiled and casually picked up the paper to examine it. Taking advantage of his distraction, Amelia Martinez quickly snatched it back, looking at him angrily. "Don't you know that entering someone's room without permission is very impolite?" Charles Blackwood suddenly realized he had seen Amelia Martinez spreading papers and drawing from the window and had walked in without thinking. Seeing her somewhat angry and serious, he quickly stepped out and knocked a few times on the door. Actually, Amelia Martinez had just said it out of habit, not expecting him to take it seriously. Seeing his gesture, she couldn't remain angry, although she was worried he might have seen her secret. She said softly, "There's no need for such formality, Your Highness. Let me tidy up first." "Why so formal?" "Just call me Charles," he said, opening his fan with a casual flourish and glancing around. He noticed her harmonica and seemed interested, fiddling with it until it made a sound. Seeing Charles place the harmonica to his lips, Amelia Martinez's face turned red. "Wasn't that? May I ask what brings you here, Your Highness?" "Charles?" Amelia Martinez asked once she had tidied up and ensured nothing was left out. "Tonight is our annual Lantern Festival in North Exian Kingdom. Would you like to go out and see it with me?" Charles Blackwood didn't put the harmonica back. Instead, he handed it to Amelia Martinez, as if waiting for her answer. Seeing that Charles Blackwood was inviting her to go out, Amelia Martinez was a bit puzzled. Although they had made plans last time, this time, she felt something was off. In her mind, she thought, "You spent time with your cousin just this morning, and now you're here inviting me? Charles Blackwood, you really are a romantic. Can't let anyone go, can you?" Then why don't you bring your cousin along? The more, the merrier, Amelia Martinez said nonchalantly. Charles Blackwood frowned slightly. Did Amelia Martinez really not know, or was she pretending not to? She actually suggested he bring along Isabella Thorne. Could she be jealous? Amused at the thought, Charles Blackwood smiled without a word and moved a little closer to Amelia Martinez. Tonight, I'm here for you. Amelia Martinez blushed deeply. She didn't think she felt anything for him, but that one sentence sent her heart racing. The way he interpreted her reaction as a game of playing hard to get, how could she not be flustered? As Charles Blackwood walked away, Amelia Martinez was left wondering whether she should attend the festival with him tonight. In truth, Amelia Martinez did want to go, though for an even deeper reason, she wanted Henry Blackwood to come looking for her. She wasn't sure why she felt such a longing, but at times, feelings can be hard to control. Shaking her head in frustration, she wondered why she kept finding excuses. While Amelia Martinez was getting ready, Ava Wilson came by once again. Although her wound had begun to heal, Ava Wilson still brought medicine each day, and the taste had improved a great deal. Amelia Martinez initially didn't want to drink it, but to avoid more conversation with Ava Wilson, she took it in silence. Ava Wilson seemed to understand and simply placed the medicine down with a few reminders before quietly taking her leave. Watching Ava Wilson fade away, Amelia Martinez thought to herself, she must be reporting back. As dusk began to fall, the eastern courtyard grew quieter. Shadows flickered across the bamboo grove, and the rustling sounds were unsettling. Holding up the hem of her dress, Amelia Martinez slipped out under cover of night. She knew it wasn't really an escape, despite the night's camouflage, she knew that watchful eyes had never left her. I don't understand why the prince insists on doing this, Ava Wilson muttered as she watched Amelia Martinez leave, her voice tinged with confusion. We're here to follow orders, nothing more. Protecting Amelia is all that matters. Recently, Amelia seems to be getting suspicious of us, so it's best to stay cautious, replied James Smith beside her. The figure in the shadows sighed softly. The schemes between the princes were beyond their comprehension, all they knew was to obey orders. Watching Amelia Martinez vanish into the distance, they worried what might happen next and, unsettled, followed her quietly. Charles Blackwood was already there waiting, looking as if he had absolute confidence in her arrival. Amelia Martinez sighed. Did he really think so highly of himself that he was certain she would come? Seeing him there, she fell silent, and Charles Blackwood's smile grew even warmer. Before she could react, Charles Blackwood wrapped his arm around her waist and, with lightness and grace, carried her across the bustling streets, leaping from roof to roof. The last time she had experienced such a thrill was shortly after she had first arrived, when Henry Blackwood had brought her to the Chinying Pavilion. That night was one she would never forget. This familiar scene played out once again, but this time, besides the firm grip around her waist, Amelia Martinez felt as if she were floating in midair. Instinctively, she clung tightly to Charles Blackwood, keeping her eyes closed, unable to open them, as the sound of the wind rushed past her. She wasn't sure how long it had been, maybe the time it took to drink half a cup of tea, before the two of them lightly landed in a pavilion. Surrounding them along the lakeside were many people releasing flower lanterns, festive lights and lanterns were everywhere, illuminating the night. It was rare to see North Exyan Kingdom so lively after dark. It's not that far. Was all that really necessary? Amelia Martinez thought of her ungraceful reaction just now, all because Charles Blackwood had deliberately startled her. She was a bit annoyed, seeing him stand there as if nothing had happened while she still felt dizzy, as if her insides were churning. Unable to hold back, she voiced her complaint. All right, now we can enjoy ourselves peacefully, Charles Blackwood said nonchalantly, as if he hadn't heard Amelia Martinez's words. Enjoy peacefully? Could it be that someone was following them just now? The thought crossed Amelia Martinez's mind, and she suddenly understood, was it Ava Wilson and her group? The idea that she couldn't even relax while out for an evening made her feel even more frustrated. Henry Blackwood, you truly are a curious one, aren't you? Are you worried I'd give you a green hat? She thought. I am not someone who would do such a thing. Was it Ava Wilson and her group? Amelia Martinez still wasn't sure, fearing she might misjudge someone. She glanced at Charles Blackwood to confirm, hoping that it was just her misunderstanding. But the more Amelia Martinez thought about it, the more likely it seemed. Charles Blackwood saw that she had figured it out and couldn't help but smile approvingly. Amelia, you really are clever. It seems you were already cautious. Amelia Martinez forced a slight smile, feeling more indignant than anything, though she didn't want to reveal her irritation in front of Charles Blackwood. She gave a flimsy excuse, Sister Ava Wilson and the others are just concerned about my safety. You know, after what happened last time at Serene Shadow Pavilion, Emily Johnson is still recovering. They must still be worried. As Amelia Martinez spoke, she began to convince herself. But Charles Blackwood sneered dismissively, exposing her self-deception without hesitation. Amelia, if that were truly what you believed, you wouldn't have snuck out tonight. And you guessed right away it was them, which means you've been suspicious all along. Amelia Martinez flushed, her face alternating between red and pale. She really didn't want to admit this fact. It was one thing to question it privately but another to let someone else in on her inner thoughts. Being around Charles Blackwood made her feel pressured, as though he could read her mind. No matter how she tried to hide her true feelings, she couldn't escape his perceptive gaze. It was as if she were standing completely exposed before him. Why should I be wary of them? They wouldn't harm me, Amelia Martinez retorted, unwilling to surrender so easily. But she soon realized what a foolish question that was, as if she had dug her own hole and jumped into it. Before Charles Blackwood could respond, Amelia Martinez quickly changed the subject, feigning interest. Look over there, that looks fun. Let's go take a look, she said, hurrying toward the lights. But Charles Blackwood wasn't going to let her off so easily. Instead, he reached out, pulling Amelia Martinez into his embrace. She was startled, wanting to break free, but his strong hands held her firmly, trapping her in his arms. She struggled and said softly, "Let me go." Amelia, what exactly are you trying to avoid? If you really wish to escape from Henry Blackwood, then I, Charles Blackwood, am your safest refuge. Do you understand? Charles Blackwood held Amelia Martinez close, his voice both persuasive and tender, though even he wasn't entirely sure of his feelings. A faint but undeniable sentiment unfolded between them. Amelia Martinez's body tensed. She could feel the warmth emanating from Charles Blackwood and, perhaps, a part of her began to linger on that feeling. Did she truly want to leave Henry Blackwood? She didn't know herself. Seeing Amelia Martinez fall silent, Charles Blackwood gazed at her even more deeply and lifted her downturned face. His breath came closer, pressing toward her. Amelia Martinez wanted to turn away but couldn't move. Very soon, a gentle force touched her lips, spreading like lightning throughout her entire body. Charles Blackwood ignored Amelia Martinez's struggles in his arms, trying to use this tender embrace to melt away her last defenses. Amelia Martinez had never felt anything like this. Her mind flashed back to her last kiss with Henry Blackwood. The two experiences were utterly different. Henry Blackwood's passionate, almost domineering kiss had left her nearly breathless, whereas she preferred this feeling now, like a gentle stream, soft and tender, awakening every cell in her body. She found herself beginning to linger on this sensation. In Amelia Martinez's mind, two conflicting voices started to battle. One voice urged her to keep going, to stay true to what she felt. But the other conjured an image of Henry Blackwood like a haunting shadow, relentlessly chastising her, accusing her of being fickle, unfaithful, a woman of loose morals. Amelia Martinez felt her head throb, all the beautiful feelings vanishing at once. Finally, the last bit of her reason began to take control. At that moment, Charles Blackwood had started to ease his hold. Amelia Martinez seized the opportunity, using all her strength to push him away, surprised by how easily she broke free. She had expected Charles Blackwood to hold her tightly, thinking it would be difficult to escape and that she might linger in his embrace a little longer. But it was too late for regrets now. She had pushed with all her might and couldn't take it back as she stumbled backward. Just as she braced herself for what she thought would be a painful fall, she realized the landing wasn't as harsh as expected. Opening her eyes, she found herself face to face with Charles Blackwood's gaze, so close she could even see his eyelashes clearly. Snapping back to reality, Amelia Martinez quickly straightened her clothing, finally sensing the awkward tension in the air. Charles Blackwood touched his lower lip, as though savoring the moment. Seeing Amelia Martinez's slightly indignant expression, he finally spoke, "Amelia, I'm sorry, Amelia Martinez waved her hand, signaling she didn't want to continue the conversation. She glanced at the bright, glowing lanterns and began walking toward them. At the prince's residence. Your Highness, so many people are out tonight releasing lanterns by the lake. Shall we go, please? Princess Oliver Kingsley remained true to her spirited nature. Seeing the crowds by the lake, she had even let the maids and servants have time off to enjoy the festivities. But from morning until night, Henry Blackwood hadn't moved. Now, as she watched the lanterns being set afloat, she grew impatient. Go if you want. I'm busy, Henry Blackwood replied impatiently. Yet, since his last visit to see the Empress Dowager, his attitude toward Princess Oliver Kingsley had softened. Princess Oliver Kingsley had noticed and was delighted by the change. But Princess Oliver Kingsley was not about to give up. She tried every way she could to persuade Henry Blackwood, but he remained unmoved. Although he was aware of his current position of advantage, he knew he was still at a disadvantage overall. Moreover, he had secretly learned that the Emperor would summon the two co-brothers in the coming days, though the reason remained unknown. The Emperor's power was waning, and the Empire was on the verge of turmoil. Henry Blackwood was determined to seize the throne and avenge his mother's death. Thinking of this, he slammed his fist onto the table, veins bulging, his heart full of simmering resentment. He would do whatever it took for revenge, even if it meant sacrificing Amelia Martinez. Princess Oliver Kingsley, seeing Henry Blackwood truly angered, realized that while he had softened toward her, she still shouldn't push her luck. Quickly excusing herself, she left. After all, she didn't want their hard-won harmony to be disrupted because of her. After Princess Oliver Kingsley left, the messenger quickly closed the door. Seeing Henry Blackwood nod, he began to speak. My lord, the person you ordered us to follow, we lost track of them. The messenger seemed genuinely afraid of Henry Blackwood, stumbling over his words. His only task was to follow and protect a woman, yet now he'd lost her. It was truly embarrassing. Sure enough, Henry Blackwood's anger intensified, and before he even spoke, the messenger had already dropped to his knees in fear. Henry Blackwood rose from his seat, wasting no words on the man, and went directly to Princess Oliver Kingsley's quarters. It seemed he hadn't been there in a long time. Now, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering lamp, and Princess Oliver Kingsley was quietly wiping away her tears. Henry Blackwood sighed and finally decided to enter. My lord, Princess Oliver Kingsley was startled by his sudden visit, her heart racing with surprise and fear. She wondered if she had somehow done something wrong to warrant him coming here to reprimand her personally. If you're ready, let's go. Henry Blackwood said little else, turning his back on Princess Oliver Kingsley as he looked away from her fearful expression. Did he really appear that frightening? Princess Oliver Kingsley took a moment to react, then quickly agreed, her excitement bubbling over. Yes, yes. My lord, we'll go now. She hurriedly adjusted her clothes and stepped forward, grabbing Henry Blackwood's arm. Henry Blackwood froze, momentarily surprised as he looked down at Princess Oliver Kingsley, who clung to him in such a gentle, affectionate manner. Though he felt a bit awkward, he couldn't bring himself to dampen her enthusiasm, and so he said nothing, and the two left together. Amelia Martinez and Charles Blackwood strolled along the street, with Charles Blackwood attempting to make conversation several times, but Amelia Martinez continued to skillfully evade his questions. Charles Blackwood was baffled, unsure if she was merely shy or truly upset. He reasoned she couldn't possibly be angry, so it was likely just embarrassment. Following closely behind her, Charles Blackwood pondered the situation. Meanwhile, Amelia Martinez herself couldn't quite understand her own thoughts, feeling conflicted. She couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't so simple, or perhaps it was all just a coincidence. Perhaps she was suspicious because she had watched too many dramas. Or maybe Charles Blackwood simply had genuine affection for her, with no hidden motives. Just then, Amelia Martinez recalled something Henry Blackwood had once said to her: "It's not good for a woman to be too clever." Perhaps this was what he meant. After thinking for a moment, Amelia Martinez decided to set her suspicions aside and decided to buy a lantern to enjoy the festival. "Amelia, since we're already here, why not release a flower lantern on the lake?" Charles Blackwood suggested, seeing a vendor nearby. Although Amelia Martinez didn't respond verbally, she still walked over to the lakeside. The young vendor eagerly greeted her, "Miss, buy a lake lantern. They bring good fortune." Amelia Martinez gently sifted through the lanterns with their varied shapes, finally settling on a simple lotus lantern. The vendor, observant of her graceful manner, sensed that she must be literate, so without saying much, he brought over an ink brush and paper. Seeing this, Amelia Martinez took the brush in hand. Although she had practiced calligraphy before, the script here was different. Not wanting to rely on anyone else to record her wishes, she reluctantly decided to write for herself. Taking a deep breath, Amelia Martinez lowered the brush and wrote a line of elegant characters on the paper. "What script is this? It's so dignified and graceful, written so skillfully," Charles Blackwood remarked, watching in awe as the unfamiliar characters flowed effortlessly from Amelia Martinez's hand, their strokes as poised and lively as if they were breathing. He had traveled widely across 4 nations and had a fair knowledge of scripts, but he had never seen a style so unusual yet refined. "This is Tu Kai, a unique script from my homeland." Amelia Martinez realized that continuing the silent treatment wouldn't help. After all, for someone from the 21st century, a simple kiss wasn't anything to obsess over. Seeing Charles Blackwood initiating conversation, she decided to explain. Charles Blackwood listened and thought, so this was Tu Kai. And it truly was beautiful. Charles finds himself increasingly interested in Amelia's homeland, he said sincerely. Amelia Martinez's hand trembled, and her writing wavered. Charles Blackwood noticed this but said nothing more. Amelia Martinez rarely mentioned her homeland, and he wondered why she avoided the topic. He thought to himself that if the opportunity arose, he would love to visit her homeland, a place filled with things he had never seen or heard of before. He imagined that seeing it would broaden his understanding of the world. But Amelia Martinez knew he could never go there. Just as she herself could never return, she was, in this world, a person without a home. All done. May your wish come true, young lady. The vendor, seeing Amelia Martinez had finished writing, quickly helped her roll up the paper and tuck it inside the lotus lantern. "Aren't you going to get one?" Amelia Martinez noticed Charles Blackwood was just watching her with a smile, neither speaking nor choosing a lantern, so she politely asked. Charles Blackwood was taken aback. Normally, he didn't believe in such things, so he'd never bothered with lanterns. But unexpectedly, he replied, "Sure, I'll choose one." This one." Taking the brush, he began to write, reciting as he went, "I wish to be with Amelia for life, together for 100 years. Halfway through, he paused. Amelia Martinez couldn't understand the characters he was writing, but she could tell the sentence wasn't complete. Seeing her glance over curiously, Charles Blackwood awkwardly explained, "I can't write as elegantly as you, so I ran out of space with all these big, clumsy characters. Amelia Martinez didn't think much of it. To her, it was just a formality, like her own wish for Henry Blackwood to quickly reconcile with her. These wishes weren't something she could achieve just by hoping. But she felt grateful for the attention Charles Blackwood showed her, not daring to wish for more. The two of them lit their lanterns and gently pushed them onto the river. The riverside was filled with people, many young women releasing lanterns with their beloveds, whispering their wishes. Charles Blackwood asked, "What wish did you write?" Amelia Martinez smiled, shaking her head, and then replied, "If I say it out loud, it won't come true." Charles Blackwood just chuckled. He could easily guess what she had written. It was certainly about Henry Blackwood and had nothing to do with him. Gazing at Amelia Martinez's delicate profile, he felt an urge to protect her, like her graceful script, inspiring a sense of tenderness and care. If it weren't for the struggles of power and the throne, and if he hadn't met Isabella Thorne first, he thought he would have unhesitatingly fallen for her and spent his life protecting her. "Amelia, look over there. There's a riddle game. Shall we go?" Charles Blackwood had been searching for something to ease the tension and finally found a shared interest. He had noticed that Amelia Martinez enjoyed crafting unusual puzzles, so he figured she would be intrigued. Throwing aside his princely dignity, he excitedly took her hand and led her toward the game. Before she could refuse, Amelia Martinez found herself beside some lanterns, each inscribed with riddles. She glanced over a few and found them quite simple, more suited for children. As she looked, she remarked, "Lotus, statue, fan, chopsticks, goose, painting. This one is the character for, well." Amelia Martinez solved more than half of the riddles in one breath, drawing a crowd of onlookers. Even the vendor who was conducting business nearby couldn't help but praise her, saying, "Young lady, you truly have a sharp mind. You answered so many riddles without a second thought, truly impressive, truly impressive." Amelia Martinez responded humbly, bowing her head in modest acknowledgement. The vendor, finding a rare match, grew even more enthusiastic and said, "How about I give you a few more riddles, so the young lady can try her hand at them?" Not taking these riddles too seriously, Amelia Martinez was more than eager for the challenge, so she replied, "I am all ears, sir." The vendor stroked his graying beard and began pacing, hands behind his back, then recited, "It scatters leaves in autumn, it blooms flowers in February. It crosses rivers with towering waves, bending bamboo with countless slanted stalks." Without a moment's hesitation, Amelia Martinez answered, "It's wind." The vendor nodded in satisfaction, then presented another riddle, "An ancient moon shines on the water that flows without end, water accompanies the moon through spring and autumn. Water reflects the ancient moon's light and deep within the green waves, boats can drift." After a brief pause, Amelia Martinez answered, "It's a lake." This time, the vendor was truly impressed and quickly clasped his hands respectfully, saying, "Young lady, your talent is remarkable. I am in awe." Amelia Martinez smiled modestly, feeling her earlier tension lift completely. She then playfully offered, "How about I give a few riddles for you to solve, sir?" The vendor enthusiastically agreed, and Amelia Martinez was soon surrounded by other vendors eager to see what riddles she would come up with. Amelia Martinez took a few steps, pausing here and there. She often enjoyed using witty wordplay for her riddles, but this time, she chose something more traditional. After a moment's thought, she said, "Plant a tree within the mouth, it's neither trapped nor apricot, nor fool nor scholar." The old vendor across from her pondered, muttering to himself, "A tree planted in the mouth, neither trapped nor apricot nor fool, what character could it be?" "It means bundle," exclaimed another sharp-minded vendor nearby, answering quickly before the old vendor had a chance to figure it out. The vendor who had been mulling it over nodded in agreement, saying, "Yes, that's right, it's. This riddle is truly clever." Amelia Martinez nodded with a smile and casually offered another, "Remove the top half, keep the bottom half." Divided in two halves, yet it has no bottom half. This time, no one could respond immediately. Amelia Martinez chuckled. This particular riddle had puzzled her for a long time, so she expected it would take them a while to solve as well. Just then, an unsettling voice rose from the crowd, "Isn't that Miss Amelia from Serene Shadow Pavilion?" Everyone turned their attention back to Amelia Martinez. She felt a pang of annoyance, surprised that people recognized her so clearly even in such dim light. Resigned, she could only give a polite, embarrassed smile. The old vendor, upon realizing she was from Serene Shadow Pavilion, grew even more respectful and said, "I've long heard of a brilliant young lady at Serene Shadow Pavilion, quick-witted and sharp, though I never had the chance to meet her. Today, I see the rumors were true, you are truly exceptional." Amelia Martinez quickly lowered her head, a little embarrassed, and said, "There's no need to praise me so highly, sir. Amelia only has a bit of cleverness, nothing compared to you." Her humble words made the vendor laugh, and though he repeatedly said, you flatter me," his expression clearly showed he was pleased. As Amelia Martinez glanced around, her gaze unexpectedly fell upon a familiar figure, Henry Blackwood. Charles Blackwood's gaze also briefly swept in that direction, his expression calm and indifferent, as if completely unaffected. Amelia Martinez felt uneasy. She wasn't sure when he had arrived, but there beside him was Princess Oliver Kingsley, happily leaning close to him. Amelia Martinez wanted to pull Charles Blackwood away, but she couldn't tell if he was deliberately ignoring Henry Blackwood to embarrass her or if he truly hadn't noticed. Seeing her continuously tugging on his sleeve to leave, he asked, confused, "What's the matter?" Amelia Martinez felt helpless, yet all of this was clearly seen by Henry Blackwood, whose lips curled into a mocking smile. So, this disappearance was just a game, an excuse to go out and have fun with her lover. How thoughtful, he thought. While Amelia Martinez was still hesitating, Henry Blackwood had already turned away and vanished into the crowd. Amelia Martinez felt a twinge of disappointment as she stepped forward, trying to catch a glimpse of him, but she couldn't find his familiar figure. She was surprised by the faint sense of loss she felt. Part of her had hoped Henry Blackwood would rush over, even if it meant scolding her or slapping her. Yet he had left, with a mocking smile, as if he didn't care. What's wrong with him? She wondered. Hadn't he told me to wait for him? Now he sees me with another man, laughing and chatting, yet he shows no sign of jealousy or anger, nor does he try to pull me away or even say a harsh word. Isn't that better than leaving me here alone like this? Charles Blackwood gently held Amelia Martinez back, preventing her from continuing the chase. For some reason, seeing her like this stirred a sense of pity within him. This woman could have led a happy life, yet her fate had been disrupted by the presence of two men. He felt a sudden urge to heal her wounds. Raising his hand, Charles Blackwood gently wiped away Amelia Martinez's tears. Looking at the spot where Henry Blackwood had vanished, he forced himself to speak. He already has his woman, and he's determined to take the throne of North Exile Kingdom. You should forget about him. Amelia Martinez turned her turbulent gaze to Charles Blackwood and saw a hint of sadness and pity in his eyes. She asked, "And what about you?" "I am bound by circumstances," Charles Blackwood replied with a sigh, looking up at the sky. Amelia Martinez let out a cold laugh. "There are far too many things in this world that bind us." With that, she turned and walked away. Once both of them had disappeared, Isabella Thorne and Ronald Blackwood finally revealed themselves. Seeing the weariness on Isabella Thorne's face, Ronald Blackwood felt a pang of sympathy. "Let's go." "They've already left," he said. Isabella Thorne could only nod. She had seen everything, seen his distant, sorrowful gaze. She knew she shouldn't have come out, yet she couldn't control herself. All she wanted was to watch him from afar, to guard him silently. In the past, he would always have two men by his side, accompanying her on these strolls. But tonight, the scenery was the same, and he was close by, yet he had another woman by his side. She could only gaze from a distance. Amelia Martinez, you're nothing but a pawn. The position of Empress, that belongs to me and to Brother Charles, Isabella Thorne thought to herself. Whenever she felt wronged or hurt, she would comfort herself with these words. She could never reveal this side of herself to Charles Blackwood. She wanted him to see her as a smart, generous, graceful woman who knew her place. Only such a woman was fit to be the ruler of the inner palace, and to stand by Charles Blackwood's side. Let's go back, Isabella Thorne sighed. Ronald Blackwood followed silently, unsure of what to say. The bright smile on Amelia Martinez's face and Charles Blackwood's natural, carefree demeanor lingered in his mind. He had also seen Isabella Thorne, the woman he loved most. She must be feeling heartbroken right now. Thinking of this, Ronald Blackwood couldn't help but sigh. Din Hoa Palace. The person lying on the bed was coughing continuously, and blood occasionally appeared on the handkerchief. A woman sitting beside him was diligently attending to him, wiping away the bloodstains as she shed tears. Charles Blackwood and Ronald Blackwood knelt in front of the bed, listening to his teachings. Seeing Billy Blackwood's cough worsening, they quickly crawled a few steps closer and said, "Father, please take care of your health." Billy Blackwood was half reclined on the royal bed, struggling to suppress his cough as he said, "Charles, my body is weakening day by day. Cough, cough, cough. I hope you will protect the kingdom. The only thing that troubles me, is the fourth prince. Cough, 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 your majesty, please slow down." The empress, sitting nearby, couldn't help but intervene as she saw him struggling to speak. Billy Blackwood waved his hand, signaling that he was fine. No matter what, he was determined to finish his words. After a bout of coughing and wiping away the bloodstains, he continued, "The fourth prince always thought that the empress was responsible for his mother's death. So, if you ascend to the throne, do not chase him down. He is merely blinded by hatred." Tears nearly overflowed from Charles Blackwood's eyes. He nodded repeatedly, his tears dripping onto his clothes. "Father, I have never intended to harm my fourth brother. Please rest assured." Cough, cough. I want you to swear it." Billy Blackwood forced the words out of his throat. He had wronged Henry Blackwood too much. The throne had originally been intended for Henry Blackwood, but his heart was too filled with malice. Charles Blackwood, gentle by nature, would bring peace to the people if he ascended and would show mercy to Henry Blackwood. Charles Blackwood slowly stood, raised 3 fingers, and swore to the heavens, "I, Charles Blackwood, swear today that if I ascend the throne one day, I will spare fourth brother's life and show him kindness. If I break this oath, may heaven strike me down, and may I never find peace." Finishing his oath, Charles Blackwood looked at Billy Blackwood, who nodded in satisfaction. After another fit of coughs, he finally spoke again, "Now, there is only one way to secure your place on the throne, to form an alliance with the Uajun kingdom through marriage, so they will support you." Charles Blackwood and Ronald Blackwood exchanged glances. An alliance through marriage, could it be? "Father," Charles Blackwood called out, holding back his emotions. He had already promised Isabella Thorne that he would make her empress, and now he could not go back on his word. But his father's orders could not be defied, and he had no choice but to suppress his painful voice. Billy Blackwood raised his hand, signaling for silence, and continued, "I have not finished. Charles, you and Isabella Thorne grew up together. I will not force you. Let Ronald Enichi marry the princess of Tan Noyet. Starting today, you must set off on your journey." Ronald Blackwood looked up in shock. He seemed as if he wanted to say something, but the empress stopped him, saying, "Ronald Enichi, hurry and accept the order." Billy Blackwood's coughing grew worse, and Ronald Blackwood dared not disobey, fearing it would worsen his father's illness. Immediately, he replied, "I obey, father." "Brother Ronald, you didn't have to agree back there," Charles Blackwood said to Ronald Blackwood as they exited the palace. He understood Ronald Blackwood's thoughts but didn't want his brother to have regrets for a lifetime just for his sake. Ronald Blackwood, however, was rather open-minded. Seeing Charles Blackwood's concern, he replied, "Brother has already sacrificed so much. Marrying the princess isn't so bad, and besides, I am still unmarried. Taking a princess as my wife seems fair enough. Just please, brother, treat Isabella Thorne well." Ronald Blackwood hesitated for a long time before finally managing to say this. Charles Blackwood understood. It was one man entrusting another, and a promise for a woman's lifetime. Charles Blackwood nodded firmly, "I will." The two said nothing further, and quickly returned to the manor to make preparations. Upon Charles Blackwood's return, Isabella Thorne, knowing he had been summoned by the Emperor, was already waiting for him in the study. Seeing his troubled expression, her heart sank, and she immediately asked with concern, "Brother Charles, what happened?" Seeing Isabella Thorne waiting so early for him, Charles Blackwood's expression softened. He pulled her onto his lap, played with her hair, and said, "The Emperor has arranged a marriage alliance." "A marriage alliance?" Isabella Thorne exclaimed. Standing up abruptly from his lap, looking at him in disbelief, and asked, "Did you agree?" Seeing Isabella Thorne's anxious expression, Charles Blackwood smiled, pulled her into his arms, and playfully tapped her small nose. "How could I? Having you is all I need." Hearing this, Isabella Thorne's worry turned into joy. She wrapped her arms around Charles Blackwood's neck and asked, "Then who is involved in the alliance?" Charles Blackwood's expression gradually changed. After a moment, Isabella Thorne seemed to have already guessed, and he finally said, "It's Brother Ronald." Even though Isabella Thorne had anticipated this, she still let out a soft, "Oh," in surprise. She then asked, "When will you depart?" "Tomorrow at dawn." Charles Blackwood replied. "I want to go too," Isabella Thorne said hurriedly, realizing the time was tight. "No," Charles Blackwood immediately refused, "the journey is long, and I worry there may be problems." "Yes, Isabella Thorne should stay at home," Ronald Blackwood said as he entered, supporting Charles Blackwood's decision. Seeing Ronald Blackwood enter, Isabella Thorne calmed herself a bit. She had sensed that Ronald Blackwood's feelings for her weren't as simple as sibling affection. Seeing him go to marry another princess didn't provoke any strong emotions, but to say she was entirely unaffected would be a lie. A woman always enjoys having several men admiring her. Although she didn't love them, it still stung a little to see them fall in love with someone else. "Brother Ronald, are you really going to marry that princess from Uajun?" Isabella Thorne asked carefully. Ronald Blackwood showed no obvious expression, but his resolve was evident, and he replied, "To accomplish great things, sacrifices must be made." Charles Blackwood came over and firmly patted Ronald Blackwood on the shoulder. He didn't say a word, but in this moment, silence spoke louder than words. Through a shared glance, both men understood each other's resolve. "This time, we must take Amelia Martinez with us," Charles Blackwood said, turning to Isabella Thorne. "Why?" Isabella Thorne was the first to object. She wasn't allowed to go, so why should Amelia Martinez be able to? "In any case, it's essential that Amelia comes along this time," Charles Blackwood repeated firmly. Although Isabella Thorne felt dissatisfied, she knew that Charles Blackwood must have his reasons, so she stayed quiet and silently stepped aside. Ronald Blackwood understood Charles Blackwood's intention even more clearly. If Henry Blackwood got word of their departure and tried to follow, having Amelia Martinez with them would make him hesitate, thus increasing their chances of success. "Where is it that you're going that you need to bring me along?" Amelia Martinez entered from the side, smiling as she asked. She had come to say her farewells, as she had been staying here for over a month now, and Emily Johnson's injury had almost completely healed. Since that night at the Lantern Festival, Charles Blackwood hadn't come to see her for more than half a month. Though this was what she had hoped for, she still felt a small twinge of disappointment. After all, that night had been an unforgettable one for her. Seeing Amelia Martinez enter the study, something she rarely did, Charles Blackwood assumed she had something on her mind, so he asked, "What brings you here today?" Amelia Martinez didn't hesitate, speaking directly, "I came to say goodbye. Emily Johnson's injury has mostly healed, so I thought." Before she could finish, Charles Blackwood interrupted, "Is that so? Well, it just so happens that we're going to June. If you have nothing else to do, you could come along for the journey." When Amelia Martinez heard this, she realized they were going to June, a place she knew little about. While part of her wanted to travel and see the world, she knew that Ava Wilson and James Smith wouldn't agree, so she felt hesitant. Charles Blackwood seemed to notice her hesitation and said, "As for Ava Wilson and James Smith, I'll handle them later. If you're willing to come with me, no one will be able to stop you." At the end of his sentence, Amelia Martinez looked up at Charles Blackwood, her gaze drifting to Isabella Thorne standing nearby. Isabella Thorne was watching her with an unreadable expression, though it was clear that it wasn't particularly friendly. Amelia Martinez smiled and said, "It seems I really don't have a choice, do I?" Charles Blackwood feared that Amelia Martinez might misunderstand, so he quickly moved closer to her. With a comforting yet subtly flirtatious tone, he said, "I only want you by my side. I don't feel at ease leaving you here alone. Besides, you should take the chance to travel more." Though he kept his voice low, Isabella Thorne heard every word clearly. Ronald Blackwood, noticing Isabella Thorne's slightly agitated expression, worried she might lose her temper and create a scene. He quickly shot her a look. And Isabella Thorne gradually calmed herself, realizing that Charles Blackwood wouldn't bring along someone he considered a mere burden. Charles Blackwood's words lingered in Amelia Martinez's ears, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She couldn't quite process it. What was this situation? Ignoring me for days, then sweetening me up just a bit, only to leave me hanging again. It seems you, Charles Blackwood, are playing some sort of game with me, keeping me on edge, she thought. With this in mind, Amelia Martinez felt determined to go to June, but outwardly she replied, "I'll need to think about it carefully. I've never traveled far before." Charles Blackwood didn't press her further, merely smiling as he said, "Very well, Amelia, go and think it over. I'll come by later." Amelia Martinez returned his smile and left without saying anything more. Just before she exited, she gave Isabella Thorne a smile, noticing the flash of anger in her eyes as if she wanted to devour Amelia Martinez whole. So much for the demure facade she maintained before Charles Blackwood. The saying couldn't be more true, the more innocent a face appears, the more deeply cunning a person might be. Just like Charles Blackwood, the purer his smile, the more danger it hides within. Amelia Martinez naturally understood that Charles Blackwood's reason for bringing her along couldn't be as simple as he claimed. At the very least, it wasn't the most important reason. But regardless, she had chosen to trust Charles Blackwood unconditionally. "Sister, are you really planning to go?" Ava Wilson asked. Over the past days, they hadn't interacted much, and neither had mentioned the incident of being followed that night. They both seemed to avoid the subject. Amelia Martinez nodded. As soon as she returned, she sought out Ava Wilson and James Smith to share her intentions. Just as she expected, they both frowned, appearing somewhat troubled. "If you don't have an answer yet, perhaps you should take some time to think it over," Amelia Martinez said as she sipped her tea and played a solitary game of chess. This was her last gamble. If Ava Wilson reported back to Henry Blackwood and he made no attempt to stop her, then she needn't worry. She could go without hesitation. Ava Wilson and James Smith nodded, then quietly left. Just then, Emily Johnson entered the room with a bounce in her step. Amelia Martinez quickly told her to slow down, cautioning her about reopening her wounds. Emily Johnson, who had been bedridden for so long, was eager to move around, feeling like her back would grow sores if she lay still any longer. She was also chattier than usual, as if making up for a month's worth of unspoken words. "Miss, are you really going to that other kingdom with the crown prince?" Emily Johnson asked, looking at the tea Amelia Martinez had prepared and feeling more relaxed than before. Amelia Martinez nodded, then shook her head, still undecided. She was trying to make up her mind, so she asked, "What do you think?" Emily Johnson, not expecting Amelia Martinez to ask for her opinion, hesitated, unsure how to respond. She didn't want her answer to sway Amelia Martinez's own thoughts, so she replied, "Whatever Miss decides, I'll have no objections." Amelia Martinez smiled. Only Emily Johnson had supported her unconditionally. Feeling a bit lighter, she said, "You don't need to think too much about it, just tell me your thoughts. Should I go or not?" "Well, I think the Crown Prince might have feelings for you," Emily Johnson said, tilting her head thoughtfully. It was as if she was calculating something in her mind, and then, with a nod, she added, "Yes, that's what I think. Since Prince Blackwood is already married and seems indifferent toward you, perhaps it would be better if—" Emily Johnson paused deliberately, glancing at Amelia Martinez to ensure she had permission to continue. When Amelia Martinez gave her an encouraging nod, she continued, "I think there's no harm in you going, it could just be an opportunity for you to explore a bit." But, Amelia Martinez frowned. Emily Johnson had spoken exactly what was on her mind, just as she was about to express her appreciation, only to be interrupted by Emily Johnson's "but," which unsettled her. She asked, "But what?" "But miss, you'll have to take me with you." Emily Johnson burst into laughter and, with a hint of playful affection, added, "I don't want to be apart from you." Hearing this, Amelia Martinez felt a surge of relief, her mind suddenly clear as if clouds had parted to reveal a bright sky. Since Emily Johnson had said as much, if Henry Blackwood didn't come to stop her or try to hold her back, then Amelia Martinez would feel free to go without a second thought. "Have you made up your mind?" Charles Blackwood entered the room, having already prepared everything on his end. Now, it was up to Amelia Martinez to decide. Amelia Martinez nodded but added a condition, "I'll go, but Emily Johnson has to come along." Emily Johnson, standing nearby, was thrilled, looking at Charles Blackwood with hopeful eyes, silently pleading to be allowed to accompany Amelia Martinez. Charles Blackwood seemed to have anticipated this request and readily replied without hesitation, "All right, it's settled then." Amelia Martinez nodded in agreement. "No way, we're coming too." Ava Wilson and James Smith entered, having learned that Amelia Martinez had agreed to go to Uajun with Charles Blackwood. Seeing that he allowed Emily Johnson to accompany them, they naturally wouldn't mind adding 2 more people. However, Charles Blackwood frowned, looking somewhat troubled as he glanced at Ava Wilson and James Smith with their determined expressions. He hesitated, then said, "I don't think it's possible. We're keeping this journey low-key, so I'm afraid we don't have enough space in the carriage." "No problem, we can ride horses or walk if needed," Ava Wilson immediately responded, acting as if it was absolutely necessary for her to go, as if refusal was not an option. Charles Blackwood looked even more conflicted. Amelia Martinez was caught between both sides and didn't feel comfortable saying anything. Emily Johnson, on the other hand, was eager for James Smith to come along, so she quickly appealed to Charles Blackwood, "Your Highness, please let them come too. They can protect Miss on the road." "No," Charles Blackwood waved his sleeve dismissively. Despite Emily Johnson's request, he couldn't risk bringing 2 potentially dangerous people along. The success of this trip directly affected the future throne, he couldn't afford to be careless, so he rejected them firmly. Ava Wilson and James Smith were already used to Charles Blackwood's refusals and had anticipated his unwillingness to allow them to accompany him. Fortunately, Henry Blackwood had already advised them to follow along no matter what, so they said, "Then, Your Highness, it seems sister won't be going either." Turning to Amelia Martinez, Ava Wilson asked, "Isn't that right, sister?" Amelia Martinez hadn't expected the focus to shift onto her so suddenly and was momentarily at a loss for words. Charles Blackwood raised an eyebrow, clearly curious about her response. Amelia Martinez understood that Ava Wilson and James Smith's sudden determination must have come from Henry Blackwood. Instead of stopping her, he intended for them to follow along, most likely to monitor the enemy's movements closely. By doing so, any news could be relayed back to Henry Blackwood. With that in mind, it didn't matter what she chose. If she agreed to go, Ava Wilson would insist on following her for safety. If she declined, Ava Wilson would still find a way to trail them secretly. Realizing that her answer wouldn't change the situation, she steeled herself and said, "Of course, I still intend to go." Seeing this, Ava Wilson took the opportunity to smooth things over and added, "Then my brother and I absolutely must go as well. Last time, there was an incident. We can't let anything happen to Sister Amelia this time." "Oh. And whom do you two serve that requires you to protect Amelia?" "I'll go and speak to them, assure them that I can protect her the entire way, and promise to bring her back safe and sound," Charles Blackwood responded with a sudden change in tone, feigning an amused curiosity. Of course, Amelia Martinez knew, as did Ava Wilson and James Smith, that they served Henry Blackwood. Otherwise, there wouldn't be constant surveillance. But Charles Blackwood pretended to be unaware, leaving them in a bind where they couldn't reveal the truth nor openly refuse. It seemed that if they weren't allowed to come along, they would simply have to follow behind in secret. Since Emily Johnson had said as much, if Henry Blackwood didn't come to hold her back or stop her, Amelia Martinez would have nothing to worry about. "Have you decided?" Charles Blackwood entered the room, having already prepared everything on his end. Now it was just up to Amelia Martinez. Amelia Martinez nodded but added a condition, "But I want Emily Johnson to come along." Emily Johnson, who was standing nearby, looked thrilled and gave Charles Blackwood a hopeful look, silently pleading to be allowed to accompany Amelia Martinez. Charles Blackwood seemed to have anticipated this request and readily agreed, saying without hesitation, "All right, it's settled then." Amelia Martinez nodded in agreement. "We're coming too." Ava Wilson and James Smith entered, hearing that Amelia Martinez had agreed to go to Uajun with Charles Blackwood. Seeing that he allowed Emily Johnson to join, they naturally wouldn't mind having two more. However, Charles Blackwood furrowed his brow, looking slightly troubled as he gazed at Ava Wilson and James Smith's determined expressions. He hesitated before saying, "I don't think it'll work. This trip is supposed to be low-key, so I'm afraid we don't have enough room in the carriage." "No problem, we can ride horses or walk," Ava Wilson responded immediately, as if determined to come along no matter what, not allowing room for refusal. Charles Blackwood looked even more conflicted. Amelia Martinez felt caught between both sides and wasn't sure what to say. Emily Johnson was eager for James Smith to join, so she quickly appealed to Charles Blackwood, "Your Highness, please let them come too. They can help protect Miss along the way." "No," Charles Blackwood dismissed her request with a wave of his sleeve. He couldn't risk taking two potentially dangerous people along. The success of this trip directly affected the future throne. He couldn't afford any carelessness, so he refused them firmly. Ava Wilson and James Smith were already accustomed to Charles Blackwood's refusals, and they had expected he wouldn't agree to let them join. Fortunately, Henry Blackwood had already advised them to follow, so Ava Wilson said, "Then, Your Highness, perhaps Sister will not be going after all." She turned to Amelia Martinez and asked, "Is that right, Sister?" Amelia Martinez hadn't expected the focus to shift to her so suddenly and was momentarily at a loss for words. Charles Blackwood raised an eyebrow, showing his interest in her answer. Amelia Martinez understood that Ava Wilson and James Smith's determination must have come from Henry Blackwood's orders. Instead of stopping her, he intended for them to follow, likely to observe the other side's movements. In this way, any news could be relayed back to Henry Blackwood. Thinking it over, she realized that her answer would change nothing. If she chose to go, Ava Wilson would insist on following for her safety. If she refused, Ava Wilson would secretly follow. Seeing that her answer wouldn't change the situation, Amelia Martinez resolved herself and said, "Of course, I still plan to go." Hearing this, Ava Wilson took the opportunity to reply, "In that case, my brother and I will certainly join. Last time, an incident occurred, this time, we can't let anything happen to Sister Amelia." "Oh. Then who exactly ordered you two to protect Amelia?" "I'll have a word with them and let them know that I can protect her the entire way. I'll ensure she returns safe and sound." Charles Blackwood shifted tactics, speaking in a playful tone. Of course, both Amelia Martinez and Ava Wilson knew well that they served Henry Blackwood. Otherwise, she wouldn't be constantly watched. But Charles Blackwood acted as if he were oblivious, leaving them in a bind where they couldn't reveal the truth or openly refuse. It seemed that if they couldn't follow openly, they would simply have to trail quietly behind. Seeing Ava Wilson fall silent, Charles Blackwood guessed that she was likely planning her next move. He decided to change his tone, "But since you both seem so determined, the journey to Yuejun will take more than a few days, and it could be helpful to have extra hands. So, you're welcome to join." Ava Wilson and James Smith were somewhat surprised by Charles Blackwood's sudden change of mind, but they quickly agreed. They thought him clever for realizing that even if he didn't agree, they would still follow. Having them nearby and able to monitor their actions was more advantageous than leaving them in the shadows. With that, Ava Wilson didn't feel particularly fortunate but accepted it. Seeing everything was settled, Amelia Martinez urged everyone to return to pack their things, as they'd be departing early the next morning. Emily Johnson stayed behind